On a brisk morning in April 1936, a group of young students from Strand School in London set off for what was meant to be an educational hike through the Black Forest in Germany. The group, led by their teacher, Kenneth Keast, was eager to explore the forest's rugged terrain before the Easter holiday. Little did they know their adventure would soon turn into one of the most harrowing tragedies in the history of mountain climbing. The Black Forest gets its name from the dense woods and dark foliage, and has been a beacon for nature lovers and adventurers alike for centuries. This natural mountain ranged wonder is known for its scenic beauty and historic ruins scattered throughout. Despite the unpredictable weather, the forest is a popular destination for hikers. Thousands of tourists are drawn by its legendary landscapes and the thrill of the climb. But just like any hike, the forest is not completely trouble-free. There have been cases of hikers getting caught in sudden snowstorms, and this often resulted in some trails being temporarily closed and then reopened with improved safety measures and warnings. The group from Strand School visited the Black Forest after several of these improved safety warnings. On April 16th, the group arrived at the town of Freiburg early in the morning in anticipation for the hike. Set in the middle of rolling hills and surrounded by the forest, Freiburg must have seemed like a winter wonderland to the boys. Despite the snow topping the roofs of the gingerbread-like houses, many of the boys had arrived with only shorts. Some even wore sandals. Still, the atmosphere was, by all accounts, a lively one, with impromptu snowball fights breaking out frequently as they left the town on the morning of April 17th. The hiking party was made up of 27 boys, with ages ranging from 12 to 17, and their teacher, 27-year-old Kenneth Keast, acting as their tour guide. The oldest boy, Douglas Mortefi, was along as a prefect to assist Keast in maintaining order. However, the responsibility for navigating through the challenging terrain rested squarely on Keast's shoulders and his map. But Keast's map was hardly adequate for the task. While it showed the main paths, it lacked any details about the small twists and turns of the rugged terrain, something that should perhaps have been more alarming given the notorious difficulty of the climb. Despite this, Keast did not seem concerned. He waved off the local warnings about sudden weather changes with confidence, sure they could handle a little unpredictability as they started out their hike. As they ventured deeper, the path started to climb steeply uphill, among tall, ancient trees. The boys, especially the ones dressed only in shorts and sandals, began to feel the chill of the wind. Around them, the landscape, while majestic with its towering pines and scattered ruins, hinted at isolation and the wild unpredictability of nature. Dark clouds began to gather overhead, casting shadows and hinting at a change in the weather. The mood shifted from excitement to a hint of apprehension. Mr. Keast urged them on, but the looming clouds seemed to warn them that the forest might soon show its tougher side. As they walked deeper into the forest, the wind started whipping up flurries of snow that made it hard for the boys to see where they were going. They got mixed up and had to go back the way they came. They stopped at a small inn to ask for directions, and the innkeeper looked really surprised that they wanted to keep hiking. She told them it was dangerous because the paths could get covered with snow very soon. Mr. Keast, trying to keep things light, just said, "We'll just shove the snow out of our way." And that's what they tried to do. The boys were pushing through deeper and deeper snow, which was tough in their shorts and sandals. Then they met two woodcutters who were leaving the forest because of the bad weather. The woodcutters told them it was a bad idea to keep going, but Mr. Keast didn't listen, and still, they walked on. Further up the trail, the group also met a postman named Otto Stiert, who was so concerned with their plan to continue along the path that he offered to help them return to the village or help guide them to a mining hostel. But it was already 3:15 p.m., and they had been walking since the morning. Mr. Keast still said no, wanting to keep going as they had planned. As they went, Mr. Keast noticed the worsening conditions and checked on his students. Many expressed discomfort from the cold and wetness, Yet Kiast chose to continue, deciding that a nearby village shown on his map was within reach and a safer option than retracing their steps. This decision soon proved to be a fatal mistake. Remember how I told you the maps had no details about the terrain? Well, on their way to their refuge village, the boys, already fatigued and drenched from the snow, suddenly faced a steep challenge. Climbing Kapler Wand, a difficult 2,000-foot stretch with a steep incline, worsened by the accumulating snow and diminishing daylight. On a sunny day, this would have been a difficult climb, and in the snowy terrains of the dark forest, it proved to be overwhelming. The first to fall to the harsh conditions was Jack Alexander Eaton, the school's boxing champion. Despite his strength, he collapsed from cold and exhaustion. He was quickly given a piece of cake, an orange, and encouragement to stay strong. Shortly after, another boy collapsed, and 3 others were on the brink of exhaustion. They stood looking at the steep trail ahead, fiercely whipped around by fierce winds and nearly blind from the snow. The group was in danger of being frozen solid overnight. And it was at this critical moment that Kiast finally realized the seriousness of their situation. Kiast quickly looked over his map, and he saw a safety station less than a mile away, but reaching it meant heading directly into the fierce wind. Facing the exhausted state of his students, Kiast decided instead to lead them west, away from the wind. Given the state of his students, it was the right choice for the group. But unfortunately, it all but sealed the fate of the already collapsed boys. The group trudged through rapidly building mountains of snow westwards, until eventually, the faint sound of church bells from the distant village of Hofsgrund reached them, sounding like a beacon of hope. Recognizing the dire need for assistance, Kiast sent the 2 healthiest boys ahead to find help. The others huddled together, trying to warm and revive their struggling companions. By 8 p.m., the 2 boys, having braved an hour through the snow, arrived at the doorstep of a farmer known as Eugen Schweizer, exhausted and nearly frozen. They quickly informed him of their condition, and Schweitzer, in response, immediately organized a rescue team from the village. The villagers put on their skis and set out into the snowstorm. What they found was a disaster. The remaining boys at this point were spread out across a wide area, some stumbling towards the village, and some collapsed on the mountainside. Schweitzer nearly fell over 2 unconscious boys, nearly buried beneath snow. One boy, Stanley Lyons, was discovered collapsed only 10 meters from the village inn, tragically frozen to death, even so close to safety. The group leader, Kiast, was found with 2 unconscious boys. Rescuer Hubert Whistler climbed alone for 45 minutes to reach 3 boys suffering from exposure. The heroic rescue effort carried on until every of the 27 boys had been found, lasting until almost midnight. A local doctor, who happened to be in the area, provided critical care, while the villagers used traditional methods to warm and revive the boys. Unfortunately, despite the villagers' best efforts, the harsh conditions had already claimed 4 young lives. 2 more 14-year-olds, Arthur Roberts and Roy Witham, remained in serious condition and were sent to hospital the following day. Roy Witham was never to regain consciousness. A total of 5 young boys lost their lives. The remaining boys, dazed and deeply affected, were escorted back to Freiburg to recover from the ordeal. And it's here that an already awful tale becomes even darker. As dawn broke, the wheels of propaganda began to turn. With tensions mounting between Britain and Germany in 1936, the German government of the time saw an opportunity to spin a tale of heroism. They claimed that the German government youth organization of the time was responsible for the heroic rescue of the British boys, and not the villagers. They wasted no time alerting the British ambassador that Germany would honor the victims with wreaths and guard their coffins. Media outlets on both sides featured images of the vigil, draping coffins with Union Jacks against a backdrop of German party slogans, portraying a narrative of peace and comradeship. But back in England, their parents were of course overwhelmed by the tragedy. It was unbelievable. These were young boys, full of life, going on what should have been a safe and enjoyable hike. To die in the historically welcoming and picturesque Black Forest was beyond belief, and now Germany had turned this awful tragedy into a political opportunity for their propaganda. But the British government decided to accept the official narrative and didn't press it any further. To avoid further escalation and political tension, the incident was classified as an accidental tragedy, and Mr. Keast, the tour guide, went unpunished. The area where the boys were last seen was marked and later developed into a memorial site, dedicated to the memory of those who lost their lives in this and other mountain tragedies, and a monument was put in place to honor the lost boys and to remind future hikers of the dangers that even the most beautiful mountains can hide. To the villagers and everyone in Germany alike, this incident became known as the English Calamity. It was the summer of 1974, when 8 Soviet women set out to change the world of mountain climbing. Their goal was to scale Lenin Peak, one of the highest mountains in the Soviet Union. Towering at over 23,000 feet and located deep in the Pamir Mountains, which is sometimes referred to as the roof of the world, Lenin's Peak was one of the most famous mountain ranges at the time. The region, part of the extensive Soviet Union territory, was known for its extreme weather conditions and high altitudes. While not steep or technically challenging, the sheer height of Lenin Peak makes it a daunting endeavor, as it is known for the severe weather patterns that dominate the area, especially during the winter months. On a fateful day in July at the break of dawn, Elvira Shatayeva and her team of 7 other Soviet women gathered their gear for a historic ascent. As they left base camp, situated on the rugged terrain of what is now the border between Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, the air was crisp and the skies clear, typical of a brief summer in the high mountains. Elvira was a seasoned climber with the prestigious title of Master of Sport and was meticulously prepared. She had scaled many mountains in the past and had even reached the summit of Lenin's Peak earlier, albeit under a man's supervision. For this expedition, she wore specialized mountaineering boots, durable overalls, and a weather-resistant jacket, all designed to withstand the harsh conditions expected at higher altitudes. Elvira's plan was simple. She and her crew of women would climb the peak by the Lipkin Ridge on the northeast side and descend the northwest ridge toward the smaller Rezdelny Peak. Theirs would be the first traverse by men or women of the peak. They planned to bivouac or make a temporary camp on top. This expedition was particularly significant for Elvira and her team. While experienced in the mountains, this climb through the Lipkin Ridge was to be their most challenging endeavor yet due to its altitude and the technical demands of the route. The route to the summit was not only physically demanding, but also extremely dangerous, requiring a special permit that acknowledged the risks involved, including severe weather and the potential for avalanches. So after Elvira left base camp, they met with the rest of their group, skilled alpinists and seasoned climbers from various regions of the Soviet Union. Among them were Anna and Lydia, both medics with extensive high-altitude experience, and Natalia, a geologist and volunteer rescue worker. They then began their journey toward Lenin Peak, navigating through the rugged terrain of the Pamir Mountains to reach the designated starting point for their climb. On July 30th, Elvira and her team began their ascent, filled with determination and the collective spirit of making history. They advanced steadily upwards the Lipkin Ridge and proceeded toward the summit without any problems. On August 3rd, Shatayeva called a rest day, but as they moved higher, the weather, which had been clear in the early morning, began to deteriorate. Clouds gathered, bringing with them a chilling wind that swept across the mountain face. By the afternoon of the next day, the conditions had worsened significantly, and a major storm was forecasted. The team had reached a critical point near the summit, but faced increasing danger from the severe weather. Despite the conditions, on August 5th, the team reached the summit, an incredible record-breaking achievement by this determined group of women. At 5 p.m. the same day, They radioed base camp and said that in the deteriorating visibility, they were having difficulty making out the descent and had set up their tents to wait for a break.
Visibility is poor, 20 to 30 meters. We're unsure of the direction of descent. We've decided to put up tents, set them up in tandem, hoping to discern the descent path once the weather improves.
Unfortunately, this is where things became critical. As the women remained camped in their enclosure, the storm outside intensified, turning an already critical situation into a fight for survival. With the storm raging around them, visibility dropped to near zero and the temperatures plummeted, pushing the limits of their endurance and equipment. The relentless wind and snow tested the strength of their tents, which were made of light, flimsy cotton with wooden poles and toggle closures. These shelters were ill-equipped for the conditions they faced. By morning, the storm had caused irreparable damage to their encampment, leaving them exposed to the merciless elements. By the morning of August 6th, conditions had grown even more severe, with a foot of snow and winds of 70 to 80 mph raging higher up the mountain. Attempts to descend were thwarted by the worsening storm and the physical condition of the team, some of whom were now suffering from frostbite and exhaustion from being exposed to the elements. Shatayeva began to send urgent, distressed radio transmissions to the base camp, detailing the unrelenting whiteout and worsening winds. During one such transmission, she reported that one of their members had become critically ill and later died, apparently freezing to death while holding a safety rope.
Yesterday at 11 p.m., Irina Lebimtseva tragically died during the descent.
Unable to remain at the summit in such freezing conditions, the team attempted to descend in these brutal conditions. Unfortunately, their progress was hindered by the state of their sick teammates and inadequate equipment. They were unable to dig into the hard granular snow to create snow caves due to their lack of equipment. They managed to put up only 2 frail tents on a ridge just below the summit. Over the next hours, the health of the climbers deteriorated rapidly in the harsh conditions. By the evening of August 7th, the few transmissions that could be sent painted a grim picture. The team couldn't move because of the storm, they didn't have any energy left, and their morale was crushed by the realization of their increasingly bleak prospects. They reported that some members were no longer responsive, succumbing to the cold and their injuries. The final transmission on August 8th was heartbreakingly short and scattered. Shatayeva, whose voice had been full of hope and determination just days before, was now resigned, the message ending with a sorrowful farewell, acknowledging the inevitability of fate. Her final recorded transmissions on that day were heartbreaking. "It is very sad here where it was once so beautiful. One more had died, 2 were dying. They are all gone now." That last asked, "When will we see the flowers again?" 2 others earlier asked about their children. "Now it is no use. We are sorry. We have failed you. We tried so hard. Now we are so cold. Another has died. We cannot go through another night. I do not have the strength to hold down the transmitter button. Now we are 2, and now we will all die. We are very sorry. We tried, but we could not. Please forgive us. We love you. Goodbye."
There's 2 of us left. We can't go on anymore. In 15 to 20 minutes, we'll be dead.
In the aftermath, when the storm finally abated and rescue teams could reach the summit area, the tragic outcome was confirmed. The entire team had perished, found just below the summit, and a journey meant to celebrate the triumph of humanity and feminism instead became one of the saddest events in mountaineering history. This next tragedy officially holds the Guinness World Record for the worst mountaineering disaster in history. And when you consider the stories we have been telling, that actually means something. This story takes place at Lenin Peak, which by now I'm sure you've noticed is a quite unfortunate place for climbers. Just as in the last story, the towering peak and relatively easy slopes of this mountain range had long been a magnet for climbers due to its relatively accessible routes for high-altitude mountaineering. However, the events of July 13, 1990, turned a routine climb into a tragic disaster. On July 13, 1990, 45 climbers were camped on a ledge known as the Frying Pan, located 9,500 feet up in the Pamir Mountains. They were preparing themselves for their next ascent to the mountain's summit. Among them were members from diverse backgrounds, including 23 climbers from the Leningrad Mountaineering Club, as well as climbers from Czechoslovakia, Israel, Switzerland, and Spain. That evening, a minor earthquake, measured at around 6.4, shook the region. Although the tremor was relatively mild, it was enough to dislodge a serac, which is a massive column of ice and snow from the mountain. This serac tumbled down, triggering a colossal avalanche that swept over the camp within seconds, leaving climbers with little time to react. The sheer force of the avalanche buried 43 of the 45 climbers under tons of snow and ice. Two survivors, Alexei Korin and Miroslav Brozman, managed to escape with severe injuries, but were unable to save their comrades who were buried alive. The aftermath was a scene of devastation. Now, after an avalanche, several critical events occur that significantly impact rescue efforts. When an avalanche strikes, the immediate concern is the volume of snow and debris that buries everything in its path. This snow is often composed of different layers, some of which can be extremely dense and heavy. The force of the avalanche compresses the snow, making it difficult for buried individuals to move or create air pockets so they can breathe. This lack of mobility and ventilation poses a serious risk of suffocation. But that's not all. Moments after the avalanche occurs, the snow hardens. Yes, you heard that right. The hardening of snow after an avalanche is a well-documented phenomenon. When the snow is violently displaced and compacted, it undergoes a process called sintering. Sintering is when snow particles bond under pressure, transforming loose and light snow into a much denser and more solid state, like concrete. This rapid hardening can occur within minutes, making the snow incredibly difficult to dig through with any kind of tool. And that's what happened after the avalanche in 1990. Climbers and their equipment were buried under tons of snow and ice that became as strong as concrete minutes after settling. The survivors and rescuers could hear the faint noises of their fellow climbers for hours, but were helpless to reach them. The brutal conditions of the avalanche and the immediate hardening of the snow had left them with no hope of a timely rescue. Only one body out of the 43 buried climbers could be successfully recovered. The rest were left buried in the snow, forever frozen in time. The most infamous disaster in the history of mountaineering played out at the top of the world, Mount Everest. Towering above the earth at an awe-inspiring 29,029 feet, Everest lies in the Himalayas, right between Nepal and Tibet. It's here that the tectonic forces of the Indian and Eurasian plates collide, thrusting the rocky spire ever skyward, each year a little higher than the last. This relentless upward drive has carved a mountain made up of deep crevasses, soaring icefalls, and simply stunning landscapes. Ever since the first successful summit back in 1953, the quest to reach Everest's summit has enchanted thousands of mountaineering enthusiasts ever since. And I get it. I mean, what else can be more challenging and rewarding than climbing the highest summit in the world? Unfortunately, the fame of Everest came with a disregard for its dangers. As Everest increasingly turned into a booming tourist site, there was a growing belief among some veteran mountaineers that it was only a matter of time before a tragedy struck. And on May 10, 1996, they were proven right. That day, multiple expedition teams, each with their own hopes and objectives, all planned to converge at the highest point on Earth. Among them were two notable groups led by seasoned climber expeditions: adventure consultants and Mountain Madness. Adventure Consultants was led by Rob Hall, a well-respected guide from New Zealand, known for his meticulous planning and strong leadership skills. His team included 8 clients and 7 Sherpa guides. Their mission was straightforward yet daunting: to safely guide each client to the summit and back. Mike Groom and Andy Harris, experienced climbers themselves, joined Hall in supporting this ambitious endeavor. Mountain Madness, on the other hand, was led by the charismatic and adventurous Scott Fisher, accompanied by Anatoly Bukriv and Neil Beetleman. Their team consisted of 7 clients and 8 Sherpas. Fisher's approach was known for being more flexible and client-driven, often adapting to the climbers' varying levels of experience and ambition. Both teams were on the Nepalese side of Everest, preparing for a summit push that would test their limits. And as they set out from base camp, little did they know that their names would soon be etched into the annals of Everest's history in a story marked by both heroism and horror. Initially, climbers gather at the bottom of the mountain or base camp, which is often a sprawling little village of tents and temporary shelters. Here, climbers acclimatize themselves to the weather and prepare for the grueling days ahead. The journey itself begins with relative ease, as climbers walk through well-trodden paths that gradually incline towards the higher camps, allowing them to adjust to the thinning air. As they move beyond base camp, the ascent becomes increasingly challenging. The first major obstacle is the Khumbu Icefall, notorious for its shifting blocks of ice and deep crevasses. Navigating this icefall requires precision and nerve, as climbers use ladders and ropes to climb over dangerous gaps and towering ice walls. Beyond the icefall lies other equally specific but challenging landmarks, like the Valley of Silence, a broad sloping ice valley that leads to the higher camps. At this point, the air begins to thin and the cold intensifies, making every step and breath increasingly difficult as climbers approach an area known as the Death Zone, above 26,000 feet. This point gets its name from being so warm and full of life. Just kidding. This is where most of the unfortunate casualties to climbers happen due to the scarcity of oxygen. In the Death Zone, the real challenge begins. Here, climbers would have to traverse, often alone, the infamous Lhotse Face, a steep, icy climb that leads to the South Col, the launching point for summit bids. The route from the South Col to the summit includes the Hillary Step, a nearly vertical rock formation that requires climbers to use every bit of their remaining strength and focus. While reaching the summit provides an overwhelming sense of achievement, the journey is far from over. Going down demands as much caution and effort as going up, often under more exhausting conditions. Climbers have to retrace their steps down the mountain, careful to manage their dwindling energy reserves and oxygen supply. For those who have never experienced high-altitude climbing, it's hard to understand the sheer physical and mental demands. Climbers not only battle the terrain and the elements, but also confront their own physical limits in one of the Earth's most extreme environments. On that day, the 2 seasoned climbers and expedition leaders, Rob Hall and Scott Fisher, were poised to guide their teams to the summit of Mount Everest. Both groups were pushing towards the summit amidst increasingly uncertain weather conditions, which were about to take a bad turn. As the day progressed, both Hall and Fisher faced the critical decision of whether to push forward to the summit despite the looming weather threats. Summit fever, the urge to reach the top no matter what, gripped some of their team members. Both leaders chose to continue. This decision would later come under intense scrutiny and debate. In their defense, they were both likely feeling the strain of leading such a large crew with an eagerness to summit, and were being strongly urged by their members to keep going. There was also an unspoken rivalry between both crews over who would be the first to reach the top. By early afternoon, several other expedition teams had reached the higher camps peacefully, so they both decided to press on despite the brewing storm clouds. As the weather turned, anxiety mounted. They knew that any change in weather could drastically alter their situation in moments, yet they hoped it would pass. But by mid-afternoon, the weather had deteriorated rapidly. A blizzard swept in, drastically reducing visibility and plummeting temperatures, and Hall and Fisher, along with their clients and Sherpas, were high on the mountain's southeast ridge, dangerously exposed to the storm's full force. Communication between the two leaders and their base camps became critical as they attempted to navigate their teams through increasingly treacherous conditions. Back at base camp, Rob Hall's partner grew increasingly concerned as she monitored the worsening conditions through her telescope. Initially, everything seemed manageable, despite the ominous clouds. She communicated via radio with the climbing teams, urging them to consider turning back. But by 4 p.m., the situation escalated rapidly. When Jan looked again towards the higher camps, she saw a blinding blizzard engulfing the mountain's summit. Realizing the grave danger the climbers were in, she frantically coordinated with the expedition leaders to urge an immediate descent. Meanwhile, back at the summit, both groups were caught in a desperate situation as conditions worsened. Rob Hall's last known position was near the summit, where he had stayed behind with a client, Doug Hansen, who was struggling. Despite Hall's heroic efforts to help Hansen get down, both men became stranded. On May 11th at 4:43 a.m., close to 12 hours after the blizzard had started, Hall radioed down and said that he was on the south summit. He reported that Hansen had died sometime during the night. Hall wasn't breathing bottled oxygen because his regulator was too choked with ice. By 9:00 a.m., Hall had fixed his oxygen mask, but said that his frostbitten hands and feet were making it difficult to traverse the fixed ropes.
We're glad to hear your voice. You're sounding great. Keep moving, buddy. Is your oxygen flowing now?
Yeah, I've got oxygen on.
Good. Crank it up for the uphill part. Start moving it out. Let's go.
Later in the afternoon, he radioed to base camp, asking them to call his wife, Jan Arnold, on the satellite phone. During his heartbreaking last message, he reassured her that he was reasonably comfortable and told her, "Sleep well, my sweetheart. Please don't worry too much."
He was frostbitten, he was weak, he was very tired, but that he was going to try and use the oxygen in the place where he'd spent the night, and he was going to try to come down. He told me on the final radio phone call that not to worry about him too much.
He died shortly after his final communication. Scott Fisher also faced dire circumstances. He had become extremely fatigued and possibly ill, which was unusual for the robust and energetic leader. His condition slowed his own descent, and he too became stranded in the death zone. Attempts by his teammates and other climbers to assist him were futile due to the extreme weather conditions and his deteriorating health. By 6 p.m., the rescue operations organized by the base camp were in dire straits. The teams at base camp scrambled to organize a response, knowing that every minute was critical. But the task was daunting, as navigating the treacherous snow-covered paths to reach stranded climbers was both perilous and time-consuming. It took hours of relentless effort, battling against fierce winds and chilling temperatures to establish a route for potential rescue. Throughout the night as the blizzard raged, efforts to rescue the stranded climbers were hampered by the severe storm, which made any movement nearly impossible. As dawn broke, the rescuers were finally able to make their way up the mountain, each step driven by the hope of finding any survivors. The higher they climbed, the more harrowing the conditions became, with visibility near zero and the storm showing no signs of stopping. By the time the storm subsided and rescue efforts could effectively resume, it was too late for Fisher. Hall, too, despite several desperate radio pleas for help, succumbed to the elements. The total death toll of all climbers was put at 12, which makes it one of the deadliest ever events to happen on Everest. Dead bodies often remain on the mountain, unretrieved for years on end. It is estimated that there are over 200 deceased climbers still on the slopes, frozen in time. It's even rumored that there is an unspoken rule in the mountains. No matter what happens, no one is to be rescued. But that's not quite true. It's just that at those heights, attempting a rescue is a very difficult and controversial issue. Which brings us to David Sharp. Now, David was no stranger to difficult climbs. From a young age, he had been drawn to the allure of mountaineering, starting with his early climbs in North Yorkshire to conquering some of the tallest peaks in Africa and Europe, including Kilimanjaro, Elbrus, and Cho Oyu, one of the towering giants of the Himalayas. David first attempted to summit Everest with a group in 2003. Although he didn't reach the top, he distinguished himself with his exceptional endurance. During this attempt, despite suffering from severe frostbite that resulted in the loss of several fingers, David's compassion was evident when he stopped to share his oxygen with a struggling climber from Spain. And maybe it was David's own empathy and his perspective on the goodness of his fellow man that would later cost him his life. After all, sharing precious oxygen could have impacted David's climb and even put his life in danger. The following year, David once again faced Everest but was unable to complete the final 1,100 feet to the summit. He chose to climb without supplemental oxygen, and that was a significant factor. Climbers often seek to set records, and climbing Everest without oxygen is considered one of the most challenging feats to ever exist. With this same ambition, David targeted his third ascent. This time, not only was he climbing without oxygen, but he was climbing by himself. No group, no expedition, no Sherpas. He had chosen a very basic package from a group called Asian Trekking, who provided his permit, food, tent, and other minimal items for independent climbers like David. But there was no leader, and the other solo climbers made their own schedules. His mother expressed deep concerns about his safety, but David reassured her that the dangers were manageable. He believed that the presence of other climbers on the route mitigated the risks, and I think it was his inherent trust in his fellow climbers that was David Sharp's undoing. He began his climb from base camp on May 13, 2006. Because he didn't have a radio to call for help if he encountered problems, we're not sure if he summited or was forced to turn around again right before the summit. What we do know is that he was forced to bivouac on the mountain during his descent in the dark at about 28,000 feet under a rocky overhang known as Green Boots Cave. There, he was overcome by the elements. He had no remaining supplementary oxygen, bad weather conditions, possibly experiencing equipment problems, and likely also suffering from some degree of altitude sickness due to a lack of oxygen, all on one of the coldest nights of the season. Reports later indicated that David appeared exhausted as he made his descent, and his exact progress remained unknown. A day later, David was found in the Green Boots limestone cave and in trouble. Witnesses reported seeing David in a weakened state, but no one stayed to help him. He had told his mother that the climb was less dangerous than she thought, perhaps to ease her worries. But climbing Everest is an extreme challenge, and ultimately, the responsibility for that risk lies with the climber. Others also on the mountain had paid dearly to experience the thrill and hardship of Everest, and were unlikely to risk their progress. And so, David was left alone, as he slowly succumbed to the severe cold. While in the cave, another climber briefly helped him before deciding he wasn't worth the risk and moved on. Hours later, another group of climbers named Maxim Chia encountered him, but by then, it was too late. David's face had turned black from frostbite. Despite their shock, they were advised against risking their lives for his rescue. They could only manage to send a distress call to base camp, but the adverse conditions made rescue impossible. Alone on the harsh slopes of Everest, David died. David Sharp's tragic end stirred widespread controversy and introspection within the climbing community and the media about the ethics of mountain rescue. Over 40 individuals had seen David in distress, but ignored him to continue their climb. This indifference for a fellow climber, even in the face of death, is seen to many veterans as one of the most disturbing trends in the new age of modern high-altitude tourist mountaineering. When I learned he was still alive, while those climbers simply ignored him and climbed over his body, it left me deeply troubled and saddened. It brings up a lot of questions in my mind of how I would handle that, and if I could step over someone who needed my help because I had summit fever. Rest in peace, David. In late fall of 2022, a group of climbers started off on an expedition to Draupdi ka Danda 2, only to face an unimaginable disaster. This story is a stark reminder of how unpredictable and dangerous the mountains can be. It was a cold, breezy morning on October 4th, 2022, when 46 climbers, including students from the Nehru Institute of Mountaineering and their instructors, began their summit push on DKD-2, an 18,600-foot peak in the Garhwal Himalayas of India. This peak, surrounded by the daunting giants of the Gangotri Range, became the site of one of the deadliest climbing accidents in recent history. They had spent days preparing for this moment, navigating the treacherous terrain and enduring the harsh weather conditions of the Garhwal Himalayas as they aimed for the summit. The ascent began at 3:30 a.m. under a starry sky, with only their headlamps piercing the darkness. As dawn approached, the climbers reached a key landmark, Rambo Rock, at about 1,600 feet. It was here, as they clipped a fixed line, which was meant to act as a safety measure against the slippery ice and snow, that they first felt it. A slight tremor of earth that pushed some snow off the mountain and into their path. This slight tremor was enough to pause their climb. Experienced instructors exchanged quick, concerned glances, recognizing the potential warning signs of something more ominous. They urged the climbers to move quickly and carefully, keeping an eye on the unstable snowpack around them. As they resumed their climb, the sky lightened, casting the first rays of dawn across the high peaks, illuminating the vast, snow-covered expanses of Draupdi ka Danda 2. The beauty of the sunrise was dimmed by the growing anxiety among the group as they navigated through increasingly complex terrain. Hours later, nothing much happened and everything seemed to be fine. The group went up the final stretch of the mountain without any problems, and as the summit came into view, a few instructors and strong students were fixing ropes that would make the final 500 feet easier. All 46 climbers were together on the slope, almost everyone attached to the fixed line, when suddenly, without warning, the mountains seemed to shudder beneath them. A loud crack echoed through the air, a terrifying sound that spelled danger in the mountain's silent expanse. Instinctively, everyone froze. The next few seconds were eerily quiet. Then, with a roar, the avalanche began. It started as a cascade of loose snow from above, quickly gathering mass and speed. The climbers, now realizing the incredible danger, scrambled frantically for cover. Some managed to anchor themselves to the rocky outcrops. Others weren't as quick. The avalanche toppled climbers, gaining momentum as it churned downhill. Ankush Sharma, one of the climbers of that day, recalled how, as he neared the summit, he glanced over his shoulder to find that the fixed rope was gone. His friends had all vanished. Everything happened in the blink of an eye, he says, and everything happened in silence. The avalanche swept down the slope with ferocious intensity, engulfing the path and several climbers in its path. Shouts and cries were muffled by the thunderous noise of snow and ice tumbling down. As the avalanche overtook the ridge, the fixed line snapped under the force, severing the last bit of safety the climbers had relied on. The slide carried climbers for between 15 and 30 seconds. Some came to a stop on the slope, but 34 were funneled over the lip of a deep crevasse on the mountain slope and down below. When the chaos finally subsided, the scene was one of devastation. Snow dust settled over the eerie silence that now enveloped the ridge. Survivors began to call out, searching for responses from their friends and teammates. Instructors, relying on their training and instincts, started immediate rescue efforts, probing the snow for any signs of the buried climbers. A quick head count revealed how bad it was. Several climbers were missing, and the group had to act quickly if they were to have any hope of finding them alive. Emergency protocols were enacted, and a call for help was sent out. But the remote location and the scale of the avalanche meant that time was against them. But the sheer force of the avalanche buried many of them under tons of snow, making immediate rescue efforts nearly impossible. The survivors and rescuers could hear the faint sounds of their fellow climbers for hours, but they were powerless to reach them. The brutal conditions of the avalanche and the immediate hardening of the snow left them with no hope of a timely rescue. Despite their best efforts, the rescuers were only able to retrieve a few climbers from the snow. One of the most terrifying aspects of this tragedy was the sense of helplessness felt by the survivors and rescuers. They could see the devastation and hear the cries for help, but the unforgiving environment of the mountain made it impossible to act quickly enough to save everyone. This disaster claimed the lives of 27 people, making it one of the deadliest mountaineering accidents in recent history and the worst disaster to hit the Indian climbing community. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Stay bold and live brave.